The sirens went off before the sun even finished setting, and I knew what that sound meant. 2 hours. That was all we had before the gates of the refugee sector locked for the night, and anyone caught outside the shelter blocks without proper cold gear would be moved to the outer camp, where the wind came straight off the frozen lake, and nothing stood between you and the sky. I was 8 years old, if you counted in human years, though my people counted differently. My hide was still soft, still learning how to hold heat the way it was supposed to. And I had no coat, no blanket thick enough, nothing but the thin gray wrap they gave us on the first day we arrived, back when the fleet burned and scattered every last one of us across worlds that were never built to hold something like me. The storm rolling in that night had a name already. The workers called it the Long Frost, and they said it on the radio with flat, tired voices, the kind of voices that had already given up trying to sound hopeful. Temperatures were going to drop faster than anything the sector had seen since we arrived. The outer camp, where they sent anyone without proper gear, had no real walls, just fencing and canvas. People did not come back from a night in the outer camp during a storm like that. Not people like me. I stood at the fence that separated the refugee sector from the human housing blocks, watching my own breath curl out in front of me in pale ribbons, and I tried to remember how much time was left. The announcement had said 2 hours. It felt like it had already been one. A woman in a guard uniform walked the line with a scanner, checking wrist tags, checking gear. When she got close to me, she paused, looked down at my thin wrap, and made a small mark on her tablet. I did not need to understand her language perfectly to know what that mark meant. Insufficient outer camp, tonight. My knees felt weak. I backed away from the fence before she could say anything more and ran, my claws slipping slightly on the frost-hardened mud, toward the row of supply tents where sometimes, if you were lucky, someone had a spare blanket. I did not find one. The tents were already empty, stripped bare by people faster than me, people who understood the countdown better than I did. That was when I saw him. He was standing near the gate that connected the refugee sector to the residential road, a tall man in a gray work jacket, arguing quietly with one of the guards. His voice was calm, but his hands were not. I noticed that first, the way his fingers kept opening and closing at his sides, like a man trying to hold on to patience that kept slipping away from him. I did not plan to approach him. I had learned, in the 2 years since the fleet fell, that approaching humans rarely ended the way you hoped, but the sirens sounded again, a second warning, sharper this time, and something in me decided that fear of the cold was bigger than fear of another stranger. I walked up to him and did the only thing I could think to do. I held up my wrist tag, the one marked with the guard's insufficient stamp, and I said the only phrase I had learned well enough to say without stumbling over it. "I have no coat." He turned. His eyes were tired, rimmed red, like he had not slept properly in a long time, but when he looked at me, something in his face changed, not pity. I had seen pity before, and it always looked like people looking down at you from somewhere high up. This was different. This was a man looking at a problem he suddenly intended to solve. "Wait here," he said, and before I could answer, he was already moving, cutting through the crowd toward the residential road, at a pace just short of running. I almost did not wait. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to keep searching, because waiting meant trusting, and trust was a currency I had very little of left. But the guard with the scanner was working her way back down the line, and I had nowhere else to go, so I stayed pressed against the fence post, counting my own breaths, watching the gate close by inches as workers dragged the heavy metal frame toward its locking hinge. 50 minutes, someone shouted somewhere behind me. 50 minutes until the gate locks for the night. I did not know how long he had been gone. It felt like the length of an entire winter, though it was probably only 10 minutes, maybe less. The wind had already started to pick up, sharp gusts that cut straight through my wrap and made my whole body shake in short, involuntary bursts. I pressed myself into the corner where the fence met the supply tent, trying to make myself smaller, trying to hold in whatever warmth I had left. Then I saw him running back. He was not alone. A girl about my height walked quickly beside him, dressed warmly, carrying something bundled in her arms. As they got closer, I saw it was a coat, yellow, with a hood lined in white, patched carefully at one elbow. The girl handed it to him without a word, gave me a small, curious look, and then hurried off toward the residential road, glancing back once before disappearing into the crowd. He crouched down in front of me, holding the coat out. "Put this on," he said, "puts quickly. We don't have much time." I did not argue. My hands were shaking too badly to manage the buttons myself, and he noticed, kneeling there in the frozen mud, without seeming to care about the cold seeping through his own trousers, doing up each button with steady, careful fingers, while the wind screamed past us both. It was warm, warmer than anything I had worn since the fleet fell. I felt my shivering ease, just slightly, just enough to remind me how bad it had actually gotten. But warmth was not the only problem. The guard with the scanner was still working the line, and a coat alone might not satisfy the requirement. Sufficient cold gear meant more than one layer. It meant boots, gloves, a hood that sealed properly against the neck. I had none of that. And the gate, according to the shouting voices around us, now had only 30 minutes left before it locked. He seemed to understand this before I even said anything. "Come on," he said, taking my hand, which surprised me more than the coat had. Humans did not usually touch us. "This way, there's a supply station near the East Block. They might still have boots your size." We ran. I had never run through the sector at full speed before, not like this, weaving between tents and crates and huddled families waiting for their own turn at the scanner line. The storm had arrived early, faster than the announcement had promised, and snow was already falling in thick, heavy sheets that stung my eyes and clung to my scales, melting into cold water that ran down beneath my new coat's collar. On our way toward the East Block, we passed a family huddled beneath a torn canvas sheet, a mother trying to shield two small children from the wind, with nothing but her own coat spread wide across their shoulders. He slowed for half a step, and I saw the pull in his face, the urge to stop and help them too. But the siren sounded again behind us, and he seemed to understand, the way I did, that stopping now might cost all three of us the chance to make it through the gate at all. He called out to a passing worker instead, pointing toward the family, asking her to bring extra blankets from the nearest cart, and then he kept moving, pulling me forward with him. I looked back once and saw the worker crouching beside the mother, and something in my chest eased slightly, knowing help was coming, even if we could not be the ones to give it ourselves. The East Block supply station was a squat metal building near the far fence, its lights flickering under the weight of the wind. When we reached it, the door was already being pulled shut by a worker with an armful of empty crates. "Wait," he called out, still holding my hand. "We need boots size small." The worker shook her head. "Out of stock since this morning. Everyone's stocking up for the storm. Try Central Supply, but you won't make the gate in time if you go there and come back." I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Central Supply was on the other side of the sector, past the medical tents, past the long row of family shelters. Even at a full run, we would never make it back before the gate locked. Not with the storm slowing everything down. Not with the crowd growing thicker by the minute as more families scrambled for their own last-minute supplies. He did not let go of my hand. He did not even hesitate. "Then we try," he said. We ran again, and this time the storm fought us the whole way. The wind had grown strong enough to push against us like a wall, and the snow had turned the ground slick and uneven beneath my claws. Twice I nearly fell, and twice his grip on my hand kept me upright, pulling me forward when my legs wanted to give out entirely. Around us, the sector had turned into something close to chaos. Families dragged carts loaded with blankets and supplies toward their shelter blocks. A group of children cried near a checkpoint, where a guard was explaining, loudly and without much patience, that the outer camp gate would open for latecomers, but the inner gate would not reopen until morning. Somewhere behind us, a siren sounded a third time, longer than the first two, a sound that seemed to mean something worse than a simple warning. "That's the final call," he said, his voice tight. 20 minutes, maybe less. Central Supply came into view just as the siren's echo faded. The building was smaller than I expected, its shelves already picked nearly bare by the crowd that had come before us. A line of people stood outside, shouting over each other, trying to get the attention of the two exhausted workers behind the counter. He did not join the line. Instead, he moved along the side of the building, scanning the shelves visible through a cracked window, until he spotted something, and knocked hard against the glass. "Boots," he said, holding up his fingers to show a size. "Small, please." The worker inside looked at him, looked at me, and something in her expression softened just slightly. She disappeared for a moment and came back with a pair of boots, worn but sturdy, and passed them through the narrow gap in the window frame. "Last pair," she said. "Good luck getting to the gate in time." He thanked her and knelt again right there in the snow, pulling the boots onto my feet with the same careful, quick hands he had used on the coat's buttons. They were slightly too big, but he tightened the laces as best he could and stood, already pulling me forward before I had fully found my balance. "The gate," he said. "Now." We ran the last stretch together, the storm now a full whiteout around us, snow so thick I could barely see more than a few steps ahead. My lungs burned with the cold air, my new boots slipping slightly with every stride. But I did not slow down, because slowing down meant the outer camp, and the outer camp meant a night I might not survive. I could see the gate ahead, its heavy metal frame nearly closed, workers straining against the wind to force the last few feet shut. A guard stood beside it, shouting something into a radio, waving people back, telling them it was too late, that the gate was closing whether they had made it or not. He did not stop running. He pulled me forward, shouting something I could not fully make out over the wind, and the guard turned toward us, radio still pressed to his ear, and for one terrible moment, I thought he was going to shake his head and turn away. The gap between the two halves of the gate had shrunk to barely the width of a single body, and behind the guard I could see workers already reaching for the locking bar, ready to seal it the instant he gave the signal. "Please," he shouted, still gripping my hand. "She's a child. We're almost there." The guard looked at me, at the coat, at the boots, still too big for my feet, and something in his expression shifted. He threw one arm out, holding the workers back for just a few more seconds, and waved us forward with the other. "Go," he shouted. "Now," before I changed my mind. We did not need to be told twice. We made it, both of us stumbling through the last foot of space before the gate finally sealed shut behind us, with a heavy, final sound that echoed even over the storm. A medical worker near the inner checkpoint waved us toward a small heated tent, checking wrist tags against a list, calling out names as families passed through for a final warmth check before being cleared to return to their shelter blocks. She took one look at my shaking hands and pulled me gently onto a stool, wrapping a thin thermal blanket over the coat I already wore, pressing two warm fingers to my wrist to check my pulse. Her frown eased slowly into something closer to relief. "Close," she said, mostly to herself. "Very close. Another 20 minutes out there, and this would have gone very differently." He stood beside the stool the whole time, arms crossed, watching the workers' instruments with the same tense focus he had carried through the entire run across the sector. When she finally nodded and said I was clear, warm enough, no danger of frost sickness, I watched the tension leave his shoulders all at once, like a held breath finally released. I stood there for a moment, chest heaving, snow melting against my new coat, my new boots soaked through but still holding, and I realized I was crying, though I was not entirely sure why. Relief, maybe? Or something bigger than relief, something I did not yet have a word for. He knelt in front of me again, brushing snow from my shoulders, checking the buttons on the coat like a man making sure a job had been done properly. "You're safe now," he said. "You did good. You kept up the whole way." I looked up at him, at the tired lines around his eyes, at the snow already gathering in his hair, and I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment he first crouched down at the fence. "Why did you help me?" I asked. "You don't know me." He was quiet for a moment, the way people get quiet when they are deciding how much of the truth to share. "I have a daughter," he said finally. "She's the one who gave you the coat. And there was someone who helped me once, a long time ago, when I needed it more than I ever admitted to anyone. I told myself, if I ever got the chance to do the same for someone else, I would take it. Tonight, I got the chance." I did not fully understand everything he meant, not then. I only understood that a stranger had run through a storm with me, had argued with a worker through a cracked window, had knelt in the snow twice to make sure my coat and boots fit properly, all without asking for anything in return. The storm raged outside the sector walls for 3 days after that night. I heard later that the outer camp lost power entirely, that the workers had to evacuate everyone still there to emergency shelters further inland, and that it had been the worst storm the region had seen in over a decade. I thought about that often in the years that followed, how close I had come to being on the wrong side of that gate. I wore that yellow coat every winter after that, until I finally outgrew it, until my scales thickened enough with age that the cold stopped being something that could reach all the way through them. By then, I understood far more of his language, far more of his world, and I understood, finally, exactly what he had meant that night at the gate. I stayed in that sector for 6 more years, long enough to watch new families arrive on the transport ships, tired and frightened in exactly the way I once was. I learned the layout of the supply stations, the schedules of the storms, the names of the workers who kept spare boots hidden under their counters for children who needed them most. I became someone the new arrivals recognized, someone who knew which lines moved quickly and which gates closed early, and I never once forgot the reason I knew any of it at all. Years later, long after I had left that sector for a warmer world, with real seasons and open sky, I found myself standing at the edge of a very different kind of danger. A supply transport had broken down on a dry, cracked road outside a settlement struggling through a brutal heat wave, and a young boy from a newly arrived family had wandered too far from the shelter tents, chasing after a stray pack animal, and had collapsed from the heat before anyone noticed he was missing. I was the one who found him, curled in the thin shade of a broken fence post, barely conscious, his skin far too warm under my hands. I did not hesitate. I carried him back myself, shouting for water and shade the entire way, and I sat with him afterward, while a worker cooled his skin with damp cloths, refusing to leave his side until his eyes finally opened and focused on my face. His mother thanked me later, over and over, and I remember telling her the same thing that had once been told to me, on a night that felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. "Someone helped me once," I said, when I needed it more than I ever admitted to anyone. I told myself if I ever got the chance to do the same for someone else, I would take it. I think that is the only kind of story that ever truly matters. Not the kind with grand speeches or impossible battles, but the kind that passes quietly from one person to the next. A coat, a pair of boots, a hand held tightly through a storm, given freely by someone who understood, better than most, exactly what it meant to be cold and alone, with nowhere left to go. That night taught me something I have never forgotten. Kindness does not wait for the perfect moment. It does not wait for the storm to pass or the danger to fade. It runs straight into the wind, holding your hand the entire way, and it does not let go until you are safe on the other side of the gate. I do not know where that man is now. I do not know if he ever learned how far his kindness traveled, how many others it eventually reached because of what he did for me on that one impossible night. But I carry it with me still, folded away like that old yellow coat, warm even now, long after the storm has passed. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind picks up and rattles against my windows, I think back to that gate, to the sound it made sealing shut behind us, to the warmth of a stranger's hand around mine, when I had every reason to expect nothing at all, and I understand now what I could not fully understand, as a frightened child standing in the snow. Kindness is never wasted. It moves from one hand to the next, quietly, patiently, until it reaches exactly the person who needs it most, on exactly the night they need it.